at the end. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So we're at Rule 15. This is relief from loose impediments and movable obstructions, including a ball or ball marker helping or interfering with play. So this rule is broken up into 3 sections, right? So we've got Rule 15.1, loose impediments, 15.2, movable obstructions, right? So we're going to break the difference down in those, and it's a pretty clear difference, obviously. And then we have 15.3, which is ball or ball marker and helping or interfering with play. This one, when I look at this rule, really, I think you can break it down to almost 2 rules. 15.1 and 15.2, I think, are pretty closely related. There's a lot of the same things you see there, and the procedures are very close, and it does depend, whether it's a loose impediment, movable obstruction. If it causes your ball to move, it's going to be penalty or no penalty, obviously. And then you get into 15.3, and maybe this was put in there as a catch-all, but it really doesn't have anything to do with 15.1 or 15.2, which is fine. The rules were consolidated from 34 to 24 with these new changes in 2019. So this might just have been where it made sense the most. But really, I look at this as there's 2 rules here. I mean, 15.1 and 2, we can see mirror each other in a lot of ways. And then 15.3 is kind of added in there, but very important. And we do see this a decent amount, especially on TV. 15.3 gets traction every once in a while when there's a backstopping accusation or controversy maybe on tour. So that we're going to cover last. But 15.1 and 15.2 are kind of their own little areas right there. So again, when we look at the rules, the best thing to do, I think, is to start with the purpose statement. Again, it's not rulemaking per se, but it's a general synopsis of what this rule is about in Rule 15. It's at the beginning of every rule, and we've seen it a couple times. Some of them have 2 purpose statements in them. This one only has 1, but the purpose of Rule 15 is Rule 15 covers when and how the player may take free relief from loose impediments and movable obstructions, 15.1 and 15.2. These movable, natural, and artificial objects, that's a very key phrase there. We're going to dig way more into that one, are not treated as part of the challenge of playing the course, and a player is normally allowed to remove them when they interfere with play. So again, normally allowed to remove them. That's inferring most of the time you can, but there are some exceptions, which is where the normally comes in. But the player needs to be careful in moving loose impediments specifically. Doesn't mention movable, and we'll see why, near his or her ball off the putting green. So we see area of the course is being selected there, because there will be penalty if moving them causes the ball to move. So after having broken down this rule, when you come back and read this, there's a lot going on in there, in the little subtleties of this purpose statement and kind of the ethos of the rule. Again, nothing rulemaking necessarily, but again, it lends to what we're going to see down the road here in a minute. So first off, 15.1, we're going to look at loose impediments. And this is the rule. And again, this is why the definitions are so important, because if you wanted to know what a loose impediment was, you wouldn't go to Rule 15.1 where it says loose impediments, which seems a little counterintuitive, but you go to the definitions where loose impediments are, and then that shoots you back to the rule. So it says, well, here's the rule for loose impediments. Well, okay, what is a loose impediment? So let's look at the definition first of a loose impediment. A loose impediment is any unattached natural object, such as, and before we go, we see natural object. That's something we want to highlight. That's very key. That's right out of the gate in this definition. So natural object is very important here. Right? That's kind of the defining term of what makes a loose impediment a loose impediment. So we'll keep that in mind, natural object. Such as stones, loose grass, leaves, branches, and sticks, dead animals, animal waste, worms, insects, and similar animals that can be removed easily, and the mounds or webs they build, such as worm casts and anthills, and then clumps of compacted soil, including the aeration plugs once they've been removed from the ground. Year or a couple times a year, your golf course will do that, where they do aerate, and those plugs, once out of the ground, are loose impediments. So meaning you can move them, but if your ball is on them or near them and it moves, then you're going to be penalized, and we'll cover that later, obviously. And then it goes on to say such natural objects are not loose if they are attached or growing. Again, the first part of that definition is any unattached. So again, if they're attached or growing, that's obviously doesn't meet the criteria there. And then solidly embedded in the ground, that is, cannot be picked out easily, or sticking to the ball. The old rules used to say adhering to the ball. Not that that matters, but it's just an interesting change. But sticking to the ball, so a piece of mud, a clump of mud on your ball in the fairway, and it's on the ball on its own accord, that is sticking to the ball. That's not a loose impediment. It's by definition here. It's specifically pointing that out. Again, the rule is highlighting natural. Loose impediments are natural objects. That is the most key thing when looking at what makes a loose impediment a loose impediment. So again, looking at what we've got here listed, stones loose, those are all natural. Nothing here, and this is a good way to look at it, nothing here is man-made. So all of these things occur naturally in nature. We don't have to do any of these things for them to come about. They happen on their own. They're on the golf course naturally. Again, dead animals and animal waste, worms, insects, similar animals. We don't do anything for that to happen out on a piece of land, right? Those are just part of the ecosystem of a golf course. And then clumps of compacted soil. These are natural objects. The clumps of compacted soil, you could argue, are not terribly natural because it's a very specific process to pull them out of the ground. But in the end, from a very large view, they are parts of the earth. Again, this is an important kind of point here is clumps of compacted soil. This does not include sand and loose soil, which I didn't include here just because that list goes on a little bit. But like we saw in Rule 8, sand and loose soil are never loose impediments. They just are, there's different privileges you can do on the putting green and the teeing area when it comes to sand and loose soil. So sand and loose soil are still sand and loose soil. The clumps of compacted soil. So I think there's a big difference there. And I mean, there is, but you can tell a big difference. If you ask, well, can I move it? Is it a clump of compacted soil? Or is it loose soil or sand or loose soil? I'd say if you don't know, then don't move it. But there can be a fine line, but if it's a clump of compacted soil and it says including aeration plugs, not limited to aeration plugs, then you can move that. It's a loose impediment as long as your ball doesn't move. But again, just an important delineation there between clumps of compacted soil, compacted being the keyword, versus sand or loose soil. Didn't highlight that necessarily here, but just something to think about. All right, so again, loose impediments, these are natural objects. This is the slide right here you want to kind of focus on. This is the big one. This is the key aspect of this what makes a loose impediment, natural objects. These things are pictured here. We do not have to do anything, we as in people, humans, to make these occur on a golf course. Pine cones will naturally occur on a golf course. We don't make pine cones. Again, another picture. Any of these are loose impediments. Here, and I always get this question, so I figured I'd throw it in. Someone says, oh, there's a banana skin there. Well, we're in Colorado. There's no banana trees. So that can't be a loose impediment. Again, go back. Is a banana peel a natural object or is it an artificial object? Banana peels, these come from the ground. Those do not, the earth produces those. Those are not man-made. Therefore, they're loose impediments. It doesn't matter if there's not a banana tree within 500 miles a year. If someone eats a banana and discards it, or an orange or an apple, again, boil it down. What is that object? Is it natural or is it artificial? It's natural. It's a loose impediment. They even have an interpretation on that, and I included it in here. And it says, and this is a good addition to the new rules. Under the definitions, they added interpretations, which was pretty cool. But it says fruit that is detached from its tree or bush is a loose impediment, even if the fruit is from a bush or tree not found on the golf course. For example, fruit that has been partially eaten or cut into pieces, and the skin, banana peel, that has been peeled from a piece of fruit are loose impediments, but when being carried by the player, it is his or her equipment. So interesting little tidbit there. Again, I always get people who are a little upset that banana peels, even though there's no bananas around, are loose impediments. And if my ball is resting on that and I move it and it moves my ball, I'm going to be penalized. That just goes to say, if you have a banana peel on the golf course, don't throw it on the ground, throw it in the trash. All right, so back to the rule. 15.1a, we look at removal of loose impediments. So we're going to look at what happens when we remove them. Can we remove them? What happens if our ball moves when we remove them? It says, without penalty, a player may remove a loose impediment anywhere on or off the course and may do so in any way, such as using a hand or foot or club or other equipment. So here it identifies, even if it's out of bounds, and let's say you're standing out of bounds and there's a loose impediment there, you can move it out of the way. We'll see the same with movable obstruction, but on the course, off the course, you can move it. Totally fine. We're going to see later what happens if it causes your ball to move. That's the important thing. But here, again, blanket statement, and we kind of covered this a little bit in Rule 12 with bunkers, anywhere on or off the course. It used to be in a bunker, you couldn't move a loose impediment. In a water hazard, you couldn't move a loose impediment. Now it says anywhere carte blanche. You can move it. So if it's in front of your ball a foot or two, that's obviously not going to move your ball. You can move it. Again, we're going to zero in on what happens when the ball moves when you have a loose impediment in or around the ball or in the lie, that area where the ball is lying close to anything. And this one is kind of a fun one here. It says in any way. And this is one I get a question a lot about. It's that Tiger Woods ruling. Remember that in the desert when there's a big rock and he said, hey, can I move it? Here's an interpretation that pretty explicitly says that is okay in 15.1a/1. This is kind of a boutique rule. I mean, if you're playing, you might have your foursome. Very rarely you're going to have 10, 20 people to move a loose impediment out of the way. But if you're with your group and say, hey, everyone, let's move this big branch that's in my way, that's a loose impediment, you can get help from others. And it says loose impediments come in many shapes and sizes, such as acorns and large rocks, and the means and methods by which they may be removed are not limited, except that removal must not unreasonably delay play. So you can't take 20 minutes and say, I'm going to go get a bunch of people and come over and move it. Just for example, a player may use a towel, hand, or hat, or may lift or push a loose impediment for removal. A player is also allowed to seek help in removing loose impediments, such as by asking spectators for assistance in removing a large tree branch. Again, not many of us play when we have spectators. So that's, again, a little boutique. But again, if it's our group and our foursome or whatever, or someone's driving by in a maintenance vehicle and say, hey, can you hop out and help me? That's totally fine. I haven't ever had this happen, never seen it happen except for that Tiger example, but it's in here, so they've covered it. So kind of a fun one. Back to the rule, it says the player may remove a loose impediment without penalty anywhere on or off the course and may do so in any way, but there are two exceptions. Exception 1 says removing a loose impediment where ball must be replaced before replacing a ball that was lifted or moved anywhere except the putting green. So on the putting green, again, like we saw a couple weeks ago, it's a very special place. You mark your ball, you pick it up, clean it. There's a loose impediment that was where your ball was. You can move those. If your ball moves, as we'll see, you're not going to be penalized. But again, it's except the putting green. So when we look at areas of the course, we look at teeing area, bunker, penalty area, general area. This essentially applies to the general area, bunker, penalty area, the teeing area, kind of same as the putting green. You can remove those things without penalty, obviously. But it says a player must not deliberately remove a loose impediment that, if moved when the ball was at rest, would have likely caused the ball to move. If the player does so, he or she gets one penalty stroke, but the removed loose impediment does not need to be replaced. So this is as soon as you do it, this is an instantaneous penalty, and you're going to be penalized if, and this could be a situation as if my ball is interfering with another player's stance, let's say, and I mark it, pick it up, and we kind of look at this later today, but mark it, pick it up, there's a loose impediment under where my ball was, I got to put the ball back on that loose impediment where it's replaced. And we're going to see three very specific examples of that in the interpretations that really yield back to this. This exception applies both during a round and while play is stopped under Rule 5.7a. It does not apply to a loose impediment that is removed as a result of marking the spot of ball or lifting, moving, or replacing a ball or causing a ball to move. So again, it's very specific to when you are replacing a ball on its back on its required spot, not on the putting green, and there was a loose impediment when you picked it up that could have made the ball move when the ball was there by removing it, that's when it needs to be replaced. So it's very specific to replacing a ball back on the spot, not on the putting green. Again, looking here, it's replacing, and this was something that kind of gave me pause when I was first reading these when the new rules came out. It's not simply placing a ball back on the spot or dropping a ball in a relief area, certainly. It's simply replacing it back on that spot. So that ball owns a spot on the golf course. You've had to move it for some reason, or it's been moved and you have to replace it. Someone maybe accidentally kicked it during search, and you kicked it during search, and you have to put it back. And there's a loose impediment estimated on that spot. You need to not move that loose impediment. So let's look at some interpretations. And there's three very specific ones, kind of scattered throughout the rules, really. The first one is right here in 15.1a. We're going to look at that. And 14.2c, we see another one. And then 5.7d1/2, we see a third one. And we're going to look at all these just to kind of build a picture of what this is talking about, because it all kind of points back to this. But there's three different instances. In my rule book, I have these notes written with these interpretations, so, for further guidance. again, to really paint a picture and really get a good look at what we're talking about here. So the first one we see, again, this is in the rule 15.1a3. We already covered 15.1a1, so we're really staying in these interpretations here. So this is removal of a loose impediment from relief area or spot where ball to be dropped, placed, or replaced. So here we're going to see, again, in the rule it says here's when you can't do it. Here it's going to say, well, here's some situations you can, again, to kind of broaden this picture of what we can and can't do. So this is exception 1 to rule 15.1a makes clear that before replacing a ball, the player must not remove a loose impediment, natural object, that if moved when the ball is at rest, would have likely caused the ball to move. This is because when the ball is in its initial location, the player risks the ball moving when removing the loose impediment. So again, you're not allowed to use this as a loophole to say, oh, my ball is out of where it's supposed to be in that original spot and I have to replace it. And now I can, no, the rule is very specific about not being able to remove that. It says, however, and again, we're going to see the opposite here. When a ball is to be dropped or placed, again, keyword is placed, not replaced. Replaced infers it's on a spot. Placed means, like we'll see, it could be a different spot. The ball is not being put back in a specific spot, which is the key, and therefore removing loose impediments before dropping or placing a ball is allowed. And this is when I talked about replacing and placing, right? So replacing infers a specific spot. That's where we're guarded against. Anywhere else, when we're just simply placing a ball, like we'll see, is okay. For example, if a player is applying rule 14.3b, it's dropping the ball, it's that procedure, in a relief area, or 14.3c2, when a drop ball will not stay at rest in a relief area, and the player must now replace the ball rather. It's the drop, place. The player is allowed to remove loose impediments from the relief area into which a ball will be dropped, or from it, or around the spot which the player must place the ball. So if I've dropped it twice, even before I've dropped it, I can remove loose impediments. And then once I've gone to place the ball on the spot where it landed a second time, if that gets to there, if there's a loose impediment on that spot, I can remove that because I'm not replacing it on a spot. That's really the big key here, is replacing it. That's that RE, that's big here. We'll go to 14.2c, another interpretation, again, to give us a bigger picture. Removal of loose impediment from spot where ball to be replaced. Exception 1 to rule 15.1a makes clear that before replacing a ball, again, there it is, replacing, the player must not remove a loose impediment that, if moving the ball is at rest, but has likely caused the ball to move. But there are situations where a loose impediment may move either when the ball is being lifted or before it is replaced, and the player is not required to put the loose impediment back before or after replacing the ball. For example, and the rules give really good examples here. I mean, this is a good feature of these rules is, it tells you here's what it is. It says, well, here's some common examples that we think will happen. It says a player marks and lifts his or her ball in the general area after being a request to do so as it interferes with another player's play. As a result of lifting the ball, a loose twig lying against the ball is moved. The player is not required to put the twig back when the ball is being replaced. So in the process of lifting it, a loose impediment naturally moved. I don't have to replace it. Again, the rule is very specific about when I'm replacing it. I myself cannot remove a loose impediment that would have caused the ball potentially to move in a place. Here, it's kind of inferring that natural forces maybe caused the ball to move, or me as a result of lifting the ball. In either case, that loose twig moves. I'm not required to put it back. Another example is a player marks and lifts his or her ball in a bunker to see if it is cut. While the ball is being lifted, and here's where we get into natural forces, a leaf that had been just behind the ball marker is moved away by the wind, natural forces. The player is not required to put the leaf back when the ball is being replaced. Again, still replacing it on a spot, but the stipulation in 15.1, that exception there is saying I cannot deliberately remove a loose impediment when I'm replacing a ball on the spot. So here we have the player, and here we have natural forces moving one of these loose impediments. In either case, I am not required to put the loose impediment back on that spot. Our last one, 5.7d, 1/2, removal of a loose impediment before replacing ball when play is resumed. Again, painting a broader picture here. The player must not remove a loose impediment before replacing a ball that, if removed, the ball was at rest, would have been likely to cause the ball to move, exception 1 to 15.1, which is where we at. However, when resuming play after a stop, if a loose impediment is now present that was not there when the ball was lifted, that loose impediment may be removed before the ball is replaced. So again, it's very specific, and this is a very slim situation where during a restart, a loose impediment is now present. But again, this goes kind of back to that main principle. If you play the course as you found it, when you stopped play, there was not a loose impediment in or around the lie of your ball that would have caused the ball to move. Therefore, when you start play, you don't have to now adapt to that new situation. Again, so 15.1a exception is really narrowing down on the player cannot remove a loose impediment when replacing a ball back on that spot. The player themselves cannot remove it or deliberately remove a loose impediment. Again, to affect where the ball's lie might be altered there or had to move. All right, so exception 2, we can't remove a loose impediment to affect a ball in motion. 011.3. We covered this about a month ago, but real quick, we'll go back and look. It says when a ball is in motion, a player must not deliberately take any of these actions to affect where that ball, whether the player's own ball or another player's ball, might come to rest. And we cannot alter physical conditions by taking any of the actions listed in 8.1a, which is replacing a divot or pressing down a raised area of turf, or lift or move a loose impediment or movable obstruction. So again, we go back to the rule real quick. And so we see here that you can remove a loose impediment anytime you want to, except those 2 times, those 2 exceptions, when replacing a ball back on that spot, and then when a ball's in motion. So again, the exceptions are there because they're kind of tied into other rules. Exception 2 to 15.1a is very much tied into essentially 11.3 to say, yes, you can move a loose impediment anytime you want to, except when you're doing it to affect a ball in motion. When 11.3 it takes precedent on that one. That specifically says you can't do it. And then 15.1a says, yes, points you back to that and says, this is also true. So a player wouldn't get out of jail and say, oh, well, 15.1a said I can remove it at any time. Well, yes, but the exceptions are here, and that's why the exceptions are so important. They're just as rulemaking, if not, more so than sometimes the rule, because that's very limited instances when those will take over. So the exceptions here are going to supersede the rule. So 15.1b, we're going to look at ball moved and removing a loose impediment. Because if a player's removal of a loose impediment causes his or her ball to move, the ball must be replaced on its original spot, which if not known must be estimated. Again, it's must, it's not may or should, it's must. So we're requiring here. And again, when you see that the ball must be replaced, it infers if you don't, and we'll see this at the end of the rule, then rule 14.7, which we looked at last week, would apply, and you played from a wrong place because the rule says you must put it back. And if you don't, that's a wrong place. We don't get into that terribly much, but again, it's just kind of a good note there when it says the ball must be replaced. If the move ball had been at rest anywhere except on the putting green or in the teeing area, the player gets 1 penalty stroke under Rule 9.4b, except when 7.4 applies, and that's no penalty for ball moved during search, or when another exception to Rule 9.4b applies. They have those 4 exceptions there, or 5 exceptions in 9.4 that would take over there. Again, so it looks here, it's pointing to specific areas of the course, or also to not specific areas of the course. So it's saying except on the putting green or in the teeing area, inferring, okay, if it's not in the putting green or the teeing area, then this rule applies in the general area, bunker, or penalty area. Obviously, if the ball is lying not in one of these 5, it's off the golf course and it's out of bounds, and in which case this doesn't matter. You're under stroking distance anyways. So this is applying very specifically to the general area, bunkers, or penalty areas. It's not applying to the teeing area or the putting green. So, even though it eliminates those 2 specific areas of the course, those are very small areas of the course, right? So the teeing area is not very big, and the putting green is not very big. So it's about 95% of the other area on the course where this applies. So again, the putting green, special place, teeing area, you can do a lot of things in the teeing area. You can tee your ball up, you get a perfect lie. So of course you're going to be allowed to move loose impediments there in the teeing area. And if your ball moves, it's obviously not a big deal at all. And in the putting green, we covered that 2 weeks ago where there's a lot of free reign on the putting green when it comes to moving your golf ball. So anyways, specifically to the general area, bunkers, and penalty areas. And here we have a good video that kind of shows that. And this is an instance that happens a lot where, you need to be careful when you have pine straw, because pine straw is seemingly just connected everywhere underneath. You can move a pine straw 6 inches away and move something else 6 inches away. It's all interconnected there when it falls in each other. So here we're going to see a good video of that. This is, again, these are loose impediments. This is where causing your ball to move would result in penalty. Trying to be careful. It's not very careful. So they're going to be penalized 1 stroke for moving a loose impediment. This is obviously in the general area or maybe even a penalty area. So that rule applies here. And the ball is going to, the video doesn't show up, but the ball is about to be put back on its spot. So in this case, as a player, if you're ever unsure, you know, if I move certainly pine needles, but any loose impediment around the golf ball, and it might move my ball, you're better suited just to not even try it and just play around and play the situation versus trying to take these loose impediments. Like, again, you see it a lot on TV when players are really surgical around their ball, trying to make sure they don't move anything. Again, this is why this player is penalized right here. So in this case, you know, the pine straw is just going to be part of your lie no matter what. You can't remove the pine straw in a way where it's not there. So you might as well just deal with it in this case. All right, so the end of this rule is the penalty for playing an incorrectly substituted ball or playing a ball from a wrong place, but I kind of alluded to when it says must replace a wrong place in breach of rule 15.1 is the general penalty under 6.3b or 14.7a. And then it goes on to say if multiple breaches result from a single act or related act, see rule 1.3c4. So that's the end of loose impediments. And before we move on to movable obstructions in 15.2, are there any questions or anything, Kate, in the chat that we want to look at?
Nothing in the chat, Robert. But if anyone wants to ask a question, you can unmute yourself. And
yeah, we'll take a question or two before we move on if anyone has one. All right, moving on to movable obstructions. This is rule 15.2. Again, if you want to know what obstruction is and you look in the rule, you're not going to find it. You got to go to the definition. So we're going to start there. And an obstruction is any artificial object except for integral objects or boundary objects. Those are also artificial objects, but the rules very specifically kind of silo those into 3 different areas. We've got obstructions, integral objects, boundary objects. Integral objects and boundary objects are very protected and they have their own definitions, as you can see, because they're italicized. And in every definition, when you look at obstruction, it starts off by saying that. When you look at integral object, it says other than obstructions and boundary objects are not integral objects. And when you look at boundary objects, it specifically says obstructions and integral objects are not boundary objects. So again, siloed into very 3 things, and it says it right out of the gate here. So we've got obstruction, it's any artificial object, except for those 2 things. And an obstruction is either movable obstruction or an immovable obstruction. So an obstruction is one of 2 things. It's movable or it's not movable. Movable or immovable, again, those are italicized. Those are our own definitions, which we'll see. If part of an immovable obstruction, such as a gate or door or part of an attached cable, meets the definition of a movable obstruction, that part is treated as a movable obstruction. Again, most important thing here is artificial object, right? An obstruction is man-made. That's the way to look at it. These do not occur naturally in nature. These are something that we as people put on the golf course or made or built or did something with, and we'll see an example of that. So again, we've got an obstruction, that's kind of the umbrella term, and then we've got either movable or immovable, right? So obstruction is either one of 2 things, and looking further, you know, when you break it down with the context of the rules, if it's a movable obstruction, that's covered by rule 15, and if it's an immovable obstruction, that's covered by rule 16. So again, it's important to know, okay, we've got an obstruction. Now, is it a movable obstruction or immovable obstruction? That'll point you whichever rule you need to apply here, because it's very important. And we cover removable obstructions next week. They're an abnormal course condition, rule 16, so that's next week's video. Let's look at the definition for movable obstruction. Again, one of the 2. An obstruction, so an artificial object that can be moved with reasonable effort and without damaging the obstruction or the course. And let's just stop right there and look at immovable obstruction. And it's any obstruction that cannot be moved without a reasonable effort or without damaging the obstruction or the course. So the exact opposite of a movable obstruction. And otherwise does not meet the definition of movable obstruction. So it's kind of interesting here. We've got, you know, obstruction, movable, immovable. And when we look at, you know, what the difference is, it's simply right here. A movable obstruction cannot be moved without a reasonable effort, and an obstruction can be moved with reasonable effort. So really it comes down to can you or can't you? And if it's one or the other, so it's almost like if you know what it is or what it is not, it has to be the other. So I know this is not an immovable obstruction, therefore it must be a movable, and then the opposite is true. So any obstruction fits into one of those two things. No matter what it is, it's either, if it's an obstruction, it's immovable or movable. The rules have to kind of organize those and parcel those out to say, okay, well, which rule is going to apply? Because as we'll see at the movable, you can just move it. And immovable, you can't. So you're playing around it, or you're taking relief if it's in your area of intended swing or affects your live ball, which again, we cover more so next week. And again, going back to the definition of obstruction. So obstruction's got its own definition. Movable, immovable also have their own definitions. And going back to obstruction, again, it's an obstruction is either movable or immovable. Again, right there out of the gate, it's saying it's one or the other. There's no such thing as just obstruction. Okay, this is obstruction. Well, what kind is it now? So there's the second layer to it always, because that's how we know which rule to apply. Okay, is it rule 15, movable, rule 16 for immovable? Again, we see the same thing like we saw in loose impediments, where an obstruction, it gives you a list of things. Again, it says any artificial object except for integral objects or boundary objects. And examples of obstructions are artificially surfaced roads and paths, including their artificial borders, buildings and rain shelters. Those are permanent. Those are artificial. Sprinkler heads, drains, irrigation, or control boxes, stakes, walls, rails, and fences, but not when they are boundary objects that define or show boundary edge of the course. Again, that goes back to that first little sentence there. And then golf carts, mowers, cars, and other vehicles. And right here, again, let's look, we've kind of separated these. So anything above here, that's an immovable obstruction. Anything below here, that's a movable obstruction. You know, they do mention stakes right there under obstruction. And that depends. And you know, just as a quick note, you know, if it's a white stake, a boundary object, which we just see as a parentheses there, you can't move that. That's a boundary object. That's another rule. That's out of, you can't touch that. You can't move that. We saw that in rule 8. But any yellow stakes for a penalty area, or red stakes for a penalty area, or stakes for a ground under repair, or stakes that are cart stakes that are saying, hey, keep your cart away from here, those are movable obstructions. So really the only stake you can't move is a white boundary object, right? So that's the only stake you can't move. Otherwise, right here, we know that a penalty area stake is a movable obstruction. We cover that in rule 17 here in a couple weeks. But the bottom, golf carts, mowers, cars, and other vehicles, waste containers, signposts, and benches, player equipment, flag sticks, and rakes. That bottom one is super important. You know, player equipment and flag sticks, those are movable obstructions. We're not going to cover that now. We've covered some rules, especially in rule 11 and rule 13, where, you know, you can move those, and if it causes the ball to move, then okay, that's a movable obstruction. So again, that bottom one is a good one. Again, so looking movable obstructions, these are artificial objects. In the same way we saw that loose impediments were natural, these are artificial. All these things here are really there in a broad sense to care for the golf course, right? And to care for player equipment. We've got a ball washer, clean your golf ball off, bunker rake, and a sprinkler or cover there. That's to take care of the course. We hope you're using bunker rakes. The sprinkler head there is maybe for irrigation. The hose, that's to water the golf course. And then trash cans and signs, that's to make sure you take care of the golf course. So those are all movable, right? Because you can pick those up and move them. So again, these are examples of movable obstructions most commonly: litter, a tee, a book, scorecard, trash, certainly. Those are artificial objects. Again, key is artificial. All right, so let's look at the rule itself here now that we know what a movable obstruction is, specifically, not immovable, but movable. It says this rule covers free relief that is allowed from artificial objects that meet the definition of movable obstruction. It does not, like I said, it does not cover relief from immovable obstructions. Different type of free relief is allowed under rule 16.1, or boundary objects or integral objects. So no free relief is allowed. So there it's, again, it's kind of sequestering these two off and saying these are separate deals. Boundary objects, integral objects, those are not obstructions. They're not movable. They're not immovable. They are their own thing. As we can see by the italicized words there, those are definitions. So again, we're covering movable obstructions here very specifically. And that's why knowing the rules and knowing what object is categorized under helps you apply the rules. So if your ball's up against a Coke can, let's say, well, nowhere in this rule does it say when your ball's against a Coke can, you got to know, okay, this is an obstruction. This is an immovable obstruction. 15.2 applies here. So that's where knowing the rules and knowing where any item on the golf course can be categorized by definition. Is it an outside influence? Is it a movable obstruction? Is it an immovable obstruction? Sometimes it could be both a movable obstruction and outside influence. Which one takes precedent? You got to know what it's defined as. That's why the definitions are so important. They used to put those at the beginning of the book, which I really liked, just to say, hey, out of the gate, you got to know these things. Now they're at the back, which is more traditional with textbook learning. But again, they're very important to know, the definitions there. So that's why it's important, which is right here. All right, so 15.2a, relief removable obstructions. This is broken down into several parts. We have removal of movable obstructions, relief when ball is in or on a movable obstruction anywhere on the course except the putting green, and then relief when ball is in or on a movable obstruction on the putting green. So this is kind of divided, like we saw earlier at the beginning of the talk, into two parts. We have the first part where you can remove it, and if there is any penalty associated with that, which there is not, and then relief when ball is in or on movable obstruction. So meaning it's not touching the ground, it's in or on a movable obstruction anywhere except the putting green. So there's those 4 areas of the course. And then there's the third one, which is in or on a movable obstruction on the putting green, which is that 5th area of the course. So it breaks it down really specifically in 2 and 3 and to say these 4 areas and then this one specific area. Because again, the putting green, a lot of times in the rules, you'll see this, it says a lot of things will except on the putting green and well went on the putting green. So the putting green is always treated very special when it comes to the rules. So here it's breaking it down even further and it's isolating it as one specific area of the course. All right, so in 15.2a, we see that without penalty, a player may remove a movable obstruction anywhere on or off the course and may do so in any way. And this mirrors what we saw with a loose impediment on or off the course. Again, anywhere on or off the course. So meaning anywhere, any area of the course, bunker, penalty area, general area, doesn't matter. And you can do so in any way. But there are 2 exceptions, like we saw with loose impediments. Exception 1 is the tee markers must not be moved and the ball will be played from the teeing area. And rule 6.2b4, and let's look at that real quick. It says the location of the tee markers is set by the committee to define each teeing area. Remember, the teeing area is a very specific area. If I'm playing the blue tees, it is the area between the blue tees and then 2 club links behind it. It is not the entirety of the mown area on which you tee the ball up. That's maybe encompasses the blue, the black, the white, the red tees, the yellow tees, everything. So that very specific area of the course. If a player improves the conditions affecting the stroke by moving any such tee marker before playing from the teeing area, he or she would get the general penalty, possibly disqualification. We don't get into that. In all those situations, the tee markers are treated as regular movable obstructions, which is what we're talking about here, that may be removed as allowed under 15.2a. So in all other situations, so essentially once you're outside of your teeing area or the teeing area, the other tee markers, those can be movable obstructions. The teeing markers you're playing from can be treated as movable obstructions. So here, this is one of the exceptions back to Rule 6. We didn't cover Rule 6. There's a lot going on there, but this is just kind of a callback to say, this is when the exception for 15.2 applies. You can't move it when your ball is played from, you're playing the ball from the teeing area. In all other situations, so when you're not playing it from the teeing area, it can be treated as movable obstructions and can be moved. As long as, you're not doing something that, again, you're adjusting the tee markers because you thought they were wrong. Another situation, we're not going to get into that, but one of the exceptions. And then exception 2, restrictions on deliberately removing a movable obstruction to affect a ball in motion. In 11.3, saw the same thing with loose impediments. Not going to go through it all, but again, we see here in the first part, we cannot lift or move, in either case, a loose impediment or a movable obstruction. And it mirrors it right there. I mean, 15.1a exception 2, 15.2a exception 2. In either case, again, you can move a movable obstruction anytime except those 2 exceptions, which is this was right here. So if your ball is rolling toward a bunker rake that was lying on the ground and you move it to affect the ball in motion, deliberately affect the ball in motion, that's covered by 11.3 here. And you can't lean on 15.2 and say, oh, so I can move an obstruction anytime. Yes, except these 2 specific times. And Rule 11 will take precedence. 11.3 takes precedence in that situation when you try to move a movable obstruction to affect a ball in motion. You cannot do that. All right, so back to the exceptions. And it says if a player's ball moves while he or she is removing a movable obstruction, just to add here, it infers if a player's ball at rest moves while he or she is moving a movable obstruction, there is no penalty, and the ball must be replaced in its original spot. Again, we see must be replaced, meaning it's not a may, you have to put it back on its original spot, which if you don't know, You need to estimate in C Rule 14.2, which talks about placing and replacing the ball. And here we see our kind of our first picture. Remember, the rules have done a good job about explaining what we're talking about. Then they say, here's a picture, and this is right out of the rule book. So here's what we mean. And so no matter how you learn, if you're visual or you like pictures or videos, which we'll have, then it kind of covers that for you. So here, balls against a rake. We see this a lot. You move the rake. Again, that is an artificial object. It's very clearly movable. The ball moves. As we saw, the ball must be replaced back on the spot, and there's no penalty. We see this a lot. This is an actual picture. This is why we don't recommend that bunker rakes lie on any kind of a upslope or downslope, certainly. This is no good if it's on an upslope going to the hole. If it's on the back end of the bunker and the ball will be rolling toward the hole, that is much worse. We don't cover that. But this is why we like rakes to be outside the bunker and away from play, so this doesn't happen. And if that does happen, and let's say, and again, it doesn't matter what area of the course it's in. In that case, it was in the bunker. In this case, in the general area. This is how you properly go about this situation. So here, a player's got his ball there. He's going to mark it. You don't have to. It's good procedure. Marks the ball because it's probably going to move. Movable obstruction is removed. The ball moves. No problem there. You can clean the ball in this case, right? Because you're replacing it back in a spot. We know where it was. Place it there. No penalty. That's perfect. A lot of people don't mark it, which is fine because you don't expect it to move, but then it does move. If you don't know the spot, we've seen you're estimating and replacing it back on that spot, but here the player marked it. So while not required, it is proper to do that. If you think your ball is going to move, just to show you're doing your due diligence to get the ball as best you can back on that spot. And by using a T there, we know the exact spot. So that's good procedure there. All right. So 15.2A2, we're going to look at relief when a ball is in or on movable obstruction anywhere on course except on the putting green. Again, here, notice it says in or on, meaning it is not touching the ground because it's in the movable obstruction. So let's say it's in a trash can, or it's on a movable obstruction. Let's say it's on a towel that a group in front left behind, and you're on it. It's not touching the ground here. So no part of it is touching the ground. And we saw in the other video, when it's touching the ground, you remove it, it's got a spot on the golf course. Here, in a very big, broad way, it doesn't have a spot on the golf course because it's not touching the golf course. It's in or on a movable obstruction anywhere on the course. And again, this one, like we saw earlier, this is except on the putting green. So this encompasses teeing area, bunker, penalty area, or general area. Putting green is number 3. These are those 4 specific other areas of the course. Says the player may take relief. Okay, may. You don't have to. You can play it off the towel if you wanted to. Again, yeah, we're except on the putting green here. The player may take relief by lifting the ball and removing the movable obstruction and dropping the original ball or another ball in this relief area. So since it doesn't own a spot on the golf course, we're not replacing it on a spot. Rule 14 would say, if that's the case, we need to use the original ball, except those 4 exceptions. Here, since the ball doesn't have a spot and we're going to be dropping it, as we see in a minute, you can replace another ball in this case. You can use this ball or another ball because the ball doesn't own any specific place on the golf course because it was in or on a movable obstruction. So the reference point. So now we get into a relief procedure where we start seeing the same things. You have a reference point, then a relief area, and it's telling us what areas of the course those are going to be in. The reference point is the estimated point. Again, it's estimated. It's not an exacting science, but you're doing your best here. Right under where the ball was at rest in or on the movable obstruction. The relief area, the size of the relief area measured from the reference point, which again is 1 club length or 1 driver essentially from that point. So from the point underneath where the ball came to rest, you get 1 club length, again, driver. But with these limits, the limits of the location of the relief area must be in the same area of the course as the reference point. So if it was in the general area, the reference point, and the reference point is going to be in the same area just by default because it's right underneath it. And then same area of the course as the reference point. So if it's in the general area, it's in the general. If it's in a bunker, it's staying in a bunker. So if let's say it's hit into a trash can that's in the rough by this much, and when you go through this procedure, your 1 club length gets you to the fairway, you are still within your prescribed relief area here. So that's totally fine if you wanted to do that. And then it must be not near the hole than the reference point, right? So again, we've got a good picture here from the rules to say the ball was on a player's towel, lift or move, and again, you can play that if you wanted to. Lift or remove the movable obstruction, and then drop that ball or another ball in that very wide relief area. So for a ball on a towel there, you've got a big area where you can redrop that ball. So if it's in a not great area, find a better piece of grass within that club length or where the ball is and drop it there. Use the rules to your advantage in that case. And then moving on to that last part, like we saw, relief when ball is in or on a movable obstruction on the putting green, so a specific area of the course. The putting green, the player may take free relief by lifting the ball. Again, may take free relief, you can play it. Lifting the ball and removing the movable obstruction. So again, if it's, let's use a towel again, that's a common one. Ball's on a towel on the putting green, and it's not literally occupying a spot on the golf course. It is off the putting green. Placing the original ball or another ball. Again, you can use a separate ball here because it doesn't own a spot on the golf course, even though we're placing it because it's on the putting green, it doesn't own that spot because it's not even touching the spot. It's not even touching grass here, right? Place that ball or another ball on the estimated spot right under where the ball was at rest in or on the movable obstruction, using the procedures for replacing a ball under Rule 14.2b2 or 14.2e. Yeah, the ball doesn't own a spot here. So we're using, typically you're going to use the same ball. There's no reason to change it, but you technically could. And retroactively, if someone did change it out, they wouldn't be penalized. And we're placing here. So in the other areas of the course, we're dropping it within a club length, and we're on the putting green, we're simply placing a ball or a ball back on the spot under which it had occupied right underneath there. All right, so in 15.2b, we're going to look at relief for ball not found, but in or on movable obstruction. Again, the key here is the ball was not found. If it's found, we just found out how to take relief. If you'd like, you can go through those procedures. This doesn't happen that much, but we're going to cover it. If a player's ball has not been found and it is known or virtually certain, again, when we see known or virtually certain, that's italicized as a definition. We want to look at when a ball has not been found and it is at least 95% certain that it came to rest in or on a movable obstruction on the course. If it's off the course and it's out of bounds, it doesn't matter if it came to rest in a movable obstruction, you're taking stroke and distance. The player may use this relief option instead of taking stroke and distance. Again, the player may use this relief option. They don't have to. And the only time I ever know this had happened actually was here in Colorado. I just heard, from people along the way that a rules official was sitting in a cart and a ball flew and short hopped the cart and just right underneath it and then just went right up into the cart, kind of in the workings there. And the rules official was sitting there, saw it all happen, knows the ball did not go out of that area. So it must be in the cart, which is a movable obstruction. And the player was allowed to take relief because there was a lot of knowledge or virtual certainty that the player saw it. The official was obviously right there. So this doesn't happen a lot, but it can, or let's say you lose it into a trash can or something. But a lot of times if it goes and it's known or virtually certain to be in the cart in this case, the player may use this relief option, so taking stroke and distance relief. The player may take relief under 15.2a2 or 15.2a3. Again, 2a2 is not on the putting green, and 2a3 is on the putting green. Again, how likely is it that you're going to lose a ball in a movable obstruction on the putting green? You use the estimated point right under where the ball last crossed the edge of the movable obstruction on the course as the reference point. This is kind of mirroring losing a ball in an abnormal course condition where did it estimate to have crossed? And from there, you get the reference point. And then you follow the procedures of 15.2a, which is dropping the ball within a club length of that spot. Once the player puts a ball in play to take relief in this way, the original ball is no longer in play and must not be played. And this is true even if the ball has been found on the course before the end of that 3-minute search time. And this is Rule 6.3b. There's that called knowledge or virtual certainty 6, where there's 6 instances when you have knowledge or virtual certainty. Penalty area is one of them. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks, but this is also one of them when a ball's not been found in a movable obstruction or immovable obstruction. And you put a ball in play, that's now your ball in play if you did it with knowledge or virtual certainty. Again, that's covered back in Rule 6. Rule 6 has got a lot going on. We don't cover that one necessarily, but that's a big rule. It says, but if it is not known or virtually certain, so it is not at least 95% certain that the ball came to rest in or on a movable obstruction, the ball is lost. The player must take stroke and distance relief under Rule 18.2. So So if you don't know it was lost, and you can't assume, oh, well, it's the movable obstruction. You got to have knowledge of virtual certainty to use this procedure. All right, so the penalty for playing a substituted ball or playing a ball from a wrong place in breach of Rule 15.2, you get the general penalty under 6.3b, substituted ball, or 14.7a for a wrong place. Again, that could be my ball's against a rake, I move the rake, my ball moves, I play it from where it lies. That is a wrong place penalty, not a serious breach in all likelihood. So that's why we don't like with bunkers, the rakes being in those positions, because if the player moved it just because they had to and the ball just rolled backwards and they said, well, this is where I got to play it, then they would be penalized for playing from the wrong place. So that's why we want to avoid that. Again, it happens, obviously, but that's why we choose to try to avoid that as best we can. All right, so again, to tie 15.1 and 15.2 together, remember, an obstruction is an artificial object. A loose impediment is a natural object. That, again, that's really what it comes down to. Obstruction, these are all man-made. Loose impediments, those are natural. Where did it come from? Did it come from a factory or a manufacturer? Did it come from the earth? That's a really good way to kind of break in, which rule applies, 15.1 or 15.2. So it's very important to know that, and we see that by this picture here, kind of an innocuous looking situation. Let's say your ball is right there in the middle, got a Rolo candy wrapper. Okay, that's artificial. That's a movable obstruction. So if I move that and my ball moves, no penalty, put the ball back. Totally fine. That's a pine cone. That's natural. If I move that, my ball moves, I'm going to be penalized a stroke, and I got to put the ball back. So two very different situations, even though they're really close together. Again, one is natural, one is not natural. So they're treated very differently with the rules, but it's important to know, okay, this is 15.2 and this is 15.1. So, all right, so our last section here is 15.3. Like I said earlier, this is kind of not even related to the other two. So we've talked about loose impediments and movable obstructions. This is almost a different rule. It's certainly a different section. It's kind of categorized into Rule 15, which is fine. It's just this is anything we use in those first two are really not going to apply at all to 15.3. We're really shifting gears here.
And Robert, would you like to answer questions on the
Sure, yeah.
All
right, thank you. Yeah, if we have any questions, let's do that, and then unmute yourself if we have any in the chat.
Okay, so there's a couple in the chat here. So in the WGC match play tournament, a player's caddy broke a sign in half while trying to move what may or may not have been a movable obstruction.
Mm-hmm.
If this were to happen in stroke play, is there a penalty?
Yeah, well, I mean, it really depends on, the answer is yes, and it does depend on, though, not necessarily the form of play, but if that object was a movable obstruction or an immovable obstruction. I didn't see it happen. Obviously, if it was on camera at a PGA Tour event, the officiating team there would have seen it. So if there wasn't a penalty levied on that player, I'm going to assume that it was treated as a movable obstruction. Not great to break those, but there's no penalty in match or stroke play for when you're removing a movable obstruction, it breaks. If it was an immovable obstruction and it broke, then the penalty would be general penalty. So in match play, the player would have lost the hold because their caddy broke the rule. Again, I'm assuming, because it was obviously filmed, that the rules team would have caught that if it wasn't a movable obstruction. So I'm assuming that was treated as a movable obstruction. And the form of play doesn't change the penalty. It's still the general penalty. So if it was stroke play, I'm assuming it still would have been fine, because more than likely it would have been treated as a movable obstruction. Good question, though.
Okay, one more. First off, this is a two-part question. Can you give an example of an integral object?
Yeah, well, staying on the kind of the match play, those, a lot, like on some of the shorter par fours near the water, you have the penalty area line kind of curling around the bank. And then right next to that, you have the bulkheads that are building up out of the water. Those are probably integral parts of the course, or what I would consider, because even though you're an obstruction in the penalty area, if your ball was outside of it, if they were obstructions, you get relief off of that, and they would make you play off of that. We see the same thing at TPC Sawgrass, Pete Dyes, a lot of them, where the penalty area line is this close to those bulkheads. Those are probably, and I don't know, but those would be a good example of those are integral, meaning you don't get relief for that. If your ball is this far off of it and still in play, you got to maneuver that. You might have to turn left-handed or whatever, but if they were obstructions, essentially you're allowing kind of a bumper on the side of the hole to bounce your stance off of. So those are good examples of integral objects. And then anything the committee declares integral. A lot of times you see this, and especially like, I mean, where I'm from back in the South, there's a lot of like walls sometimes that are built through golf courses, like from like farms and stuff. Those are sometimes integral to the challenge of playing the course, meaning you don't get relief from that as an obstruction. So an integral object is just something the committee has said, this is part of the course, you don't get free relief from it. That's the challenge of it. I'm blanking on a few other ones, but those are the two I can think of particularly. And on my home course growing up, we had a big stone wall going right through the middle of the course. That was an integral object because if you're up against it, that was there before the course was, and it's part of the challenge and the fun of playing those couple particular holes. So.
Okay, there's just a clarification on that broken sign. Thanks, Mike. So there was no referee present with this match and no claim was made.
That's true too, right? The match play.
And then,
yeah.
Yep. And then I'm not sure if you saw this one, the Scotty Scheffler match where he hit his ball behind the grandstand. The rules official ended up giving him 2 club lengths for his relief. Any idea why 2 club lengths versus 1? Pretty sure this was a TIO situation.
Yeah, I might have caught that one too. I think it happened a couple times, but in any case, and that's a very, I call it a boutique rule. It happens on tours a lot when you've got builds and grandstands, or that's not normally there. They put those up in conjunction with the golf tournament. So if you were playing it in a month, those wouldn't be there. So those are like, okay, just a temporary immovable obstructions. The reason, and we're not going to go to the whole relief procedure, but the reason that the player would get 2 is actually it's more than 1, but less than 2. So typically there's a corridor if you're behind it where you have to get out a club length out of that corridor, and that's the club length. And then from that, you get 1 club length or less. So the easiest way to look at it is when you're taking relief from a TIO, which again, we don't see unless you're playing on a course builds like that necessarily, is more than 1, but less than 2 typically. And again, I didn't see that one, but I'm assuming if it's a TIO, that's the procedure for it. And that's, again, fairly a boutique rule when it comes to tours.
That's it for now if you want to move on.
Cool. Good questions. A lot of WGC stuff. I think there's a lot going on this weekend. All right, so 15.3 is our last section. The ball or ball marker is helping or interfering with play. And we have the ball on the putting green helping with play. So this is divided into several sections. In 15.3a, the ball on the putting green helping play. In 15.3b, ball anywhere on course interfering with play. And then in 15.3c, we have ball marker helping or interfering with play. So again, let's break this down a little bit further. We have in 15.3, we have ball in the putting green, we have helping, and then we have 15.3b interfering, and then C, we have helping or interfering, and we'll look at more ball marker, but it's divided into, we have helping, interfering, and helping. So the first part is what we consider helping with play, and that's very specific to the putting green, as we'll see. And then in B, we have interfering with play. That's a little more common, I think, when it comes to if there's 2 golf balls right next to each other or on the line of play, that's off the putting green as well. So again, kind of divided into helping, interfering, and then C is kind of a hodgepodge because it gets into ball marker, and we'll see that more so. But in 15.3a, we have the ball on the putting green helping with play. And this is an important thing right out of the gate. It says 15.3a applies only to a ball at rest on the putting green, not anywhere else on the course. So very consolidated to a specific area of the course, the putting green that you or the people you're playing with, whether it's an opponent or other playing stroke play, it's on the putting green here. So 15.3 is very consolidated to the putting green. So when we're talking about this, just think putting green for right now. So if a player reasonably believes that a ball at rest on the putting green might help anyone's play, such as by serving as a possible backstop near the hole, the player may. And before we get to that, you just kind of notice here, it says that if a player believes that a ball or help anyone's play, there's nothing terribly possessive. It's not my ball or anything like that. Like, or if that particular person's ball is in play, it's anyone's ball. So if it's, if I'm player A and I see player B and player C over there, and players B's ball is in a position to serve for player C, even though I'm not necessarily involved in that, I could say, hey, I reason to believe that a player's ball on the putting green might help anyone's play. Again, this is a stroke play rule, which we're going to see. But I would be there to help protect the field because it does involve me actually. Because if it's stroke play, I am playing these other two players as well as the rest of the field. So this is a stroke play rule, and it's not particular to me. So if it's like, oh, I'm not involved. Well, it's stroke play, so yeah, you are. You are involved in how those other players score. So we'll see that in a little bit, but just to kind of a little note there. You mark the spot of the ball and lift it under Rule 13.1b. Again, putting green. So as we saw, anytime on the putting green, you can mark your ball, pick it up, whether it's your first, second, third putt, doesn't matter. So we know we can do that already. Or if the ball belongs to the player, kind of like that situation, I could require the other player to mark the spot and lift the ball. So I say, hey, I think player B's ball is going to help player C. Player B, I'm requesting that you go and mark your ball on the putting green so you don't help and serve as a backstop and help player C play their ball to the putting green. The lifted ball must be replaced in its original spot, which we know from Rule 13. You mark it, you pick it up, you got to put it right back down. Goes without saying. In stroke play only, again, this is isolated in stroke play. So when it comes, again, this is a good kind of follow-up to if people watch the match play this weekend. In stroke play, so in match play, it infers this does not apply. Well, there's a decision or interpretation about that in 15.3a2. It says players are actually allowed to leave the helping ball in match play, which will make sense once we read through it and I talk about it. Again, this is match play only, so it does very much depend on what form of play you're at right now. So in match play, it says in a match, a player may agree to leave his or her ball in place to help the opponent. Again, that's a match play term, since the outcome of any benefit that may come from the agreement affects only their match. So in the example I used earlier, we got A, B, and C, and then the rest of the field, there's everyone else involved. So this is a 40-player field. Everyone else in the field is also concerned about what they may or may not be doing to backstop in match play. Like we saw, I'm only playing one player. Let's say if it's just single match play. If the match behind me, it doesn't matter what they're doing. If player C and D behind me, one makes an 8 and one makes a 9 in stroke play, okay, that's maybe good for me. Match play doesn't matter. Whoever made the 8 won the hole. And on my match, I made a 3, but they made a 2. They went. So it only matters, your match only matters to you and your opponent. Obviously, if it's a partnered event, there's more people involved, obviously, but an individual match. So I could say, yeah, I'll leave my ball in place there. We can agree to do that because, really, if I'm dumb enough to say, oh, yeah, go ahead and I'll you can backstop off me, I'm only hurting myself because if the ball does backstop, truly, then I might have just saved my opponent a few extra feet on that upcoming putt. That only affects me. So if I'm willing to do that, then okay, that's on me. We can do that. We can agree to do that. Also, let's look at 23.5a. I kind of said it a little bit here, but as far as a partnered event, again, in 23.5a, in stroke play. So again, it's saying in stroke play, not match play, in stroke play only, because there's the field involved, not just mano-a-mano. Partners must not agree with each other to leave a ball in place on the putting green, help either of them or any other player. So if I'm playing with me and my partner's ball is there to serve as a backstop, we cannot agree to say, hey, leave yours there. I want to backstop off that. I can't agree to that. We're going to get more into what an agreement means here in a minute. And that's where this situation always gets a little sticky when we see it every year or two on LPGA. It happened recently within the last few years where there's accusations, whatever. The agreement's the big part, which we'll talk about. So agree, we see there in the rule. We also see it back in 15.3. So again, stroke play. This is a stroke play rule. We see it in several cases. So anyways, back to 15.3. In stroke play only, a player who is required to lift the ball may play first instead. So if someone says, hey, Robert, can you mark and lift your ball? I don't want the backstop. I could play first instead. And if 2 or more players agree to leave a ball in place to help any player, and that player then makes a stroke with the helping ball left in place, each player who made the agreement gets the general penalty. 2 penalty strokes. Again, when it says 2 penalty strokes, that's really singling out stroke play because the general penalty in match play is lost a hole. We already saw it doesn't really apply here. So in stroke play, 2 strokes. Again, looking at this, and this is something I put, if you take the CGA's rules quiz, this is something I put on there this year to say, it's 2 or more players agree to leave a ball in place to help any player. So again, it's not necessarily the two players involved. If it's my ball or player B's ball and I'm the one chipping, and I ask them to leave it in place, or they let me say, "Hey, Robert, I'll leave it in place for you," that's applicable certainly. But also it could be if me and another player, I'm player A, player B, we both are on the putting green, and I say, "Hey, let's leave our ball to help player C to help backstop." And he says, "Yeah, that's fine. Let's do that." It doesn't matter if I'm not the one or that player's not the one chipping. If we two or more agree to help any player, player C, and that player then goes on to make a stroke with that helping ball left in place, each player, player A and B, who made the agreement, we both get 2 penalty strokes, general penalty. Again, so it's not just specific to me playing the ball or the other person playing the ball. It's 2 or more players. That doesn't really ever happen, but it's just kind of something I pull out for our quiz just to show it's not necessarily possessive of, okay, well, I'm making the stroke or that other player is making the stroke. It's us two can agree, and this player has no idea what's going on. Again, and also remember, it's not if the ball hits that ball. So if I say, oh, we're gonna get a backstop, and then that player chips and it does or doesn't hit the ball, it doesn't matter about the ball having hit something in this case. We saw in 11.3 or 11.2 and 13.2 where the ball has to maybe hit something to activate that rule. Here it says that then that player makes a stroke. So the player could airmail it over the green, nowhere even close. Doesn't matter. When the stroke was being made, an agreement had been made, in any case, to backstop. And again, this is what, whenever people say backstopping, this is it right here. So again, it's all about if the stroke was made. Doesn't matter if the ball hit anything or not, necessarily. It matters that we agreed to leave a ball to backstop. And this is online. You don't see this in your actual book, obviously. But it says clarification available. And this was added. And let's look at that real quick. It's a little hard to read, but it says backstopping. And this is in the clarifications in the back of the book. And there's no, I added the word backstopping in 15.3a there. And that's just what we know to be backstopping. But the USGA and the RNA added this as kind of more as a clarification, so aptly named, to say backstopping is the common term used to describe the following situation. Again, in stroke play. We see this in stroke play only. A player without agreement without agreement from any other player leaves his or her ball in place on the putting green, close to the hole, in a position where another player who's about to play from off the putting green could benefit if his or her ball struck the ball at rest. Backstopping. As there has been no agreement to leave the ball in place to any player, there is no breach of the rules. See 15.3a. However, the RNA and USGA take the view that backstopping fails to take into account all the other players in the competition, again, stroke play. There's 40 other of us playing, and has the potential to give the player with the backstop an advantage over those other, call it 40 players. Again, what this comes down to, in looking back here, it says a player without agreement with any other player. So this is kind of the loophole, and it says without agreement. Agreement it doesn't say it in this rule, and I should have looked it up before, but in the old rules, it essentially said there's some kind of a verbal exchange that says you are saying, yes, we are going to agree to do that. If I don't say anything and that player doesn't say anything, and I leave my ball up by the putting green to serve as a backstop for whatever reason, and there was no talk, and the player that hits it, and sometimes you see that on TV, where a player's ball will be there and they quick play it to try to use it as a backstop. There was no agreement, so therefore there's no breach of this rule necessarily because we didn't agree to do that. And that's what we see here. A player without agreement with any other player leaves his or her ball in a place on the putting green. And whether it's leave or the other player quick plays, we didn't make an agreement, so there's no backstopping. A lot of people say, oh, well, they meant to do it. They knew what they were doing. Again, there's got to be an agreement. So it really hinges on, the backstopping thing hinges on, did we agree to do it? And typically that's going to be a verbal or a nonverbal communication. If I could somehow non-verbally communicate that I'm doing this as a backstop, that's an agreement. Again, 99% of the time it's going to be verbal, maybe. Again, and it's kind of, even though it applies anywhere, in this case, it kind of sets up a time frame of when a ball in place on the putting green in a position where another player who's about to play from off the putting green could benefit. So in this case, as we've seen, if a ball is chipped up and let's say we're 100 yards away, so it's not applicable really to say, hey, I'm going to go mark my ball. Ball's on the putting green, it hits another ball. The ball that was live was played as it live, but the ball at rest, you put it back. there's no penalty there. If this were on the putting green, so the reason this is calling it from ball on the putting green, ball off the putting green, there's no penalty associated in there inherently unless an agreement was made. So if I'm chipping, I hit a bad chip and it goes that way, and the ball wasn't in a position to backstop, but I just hit it so poorly, our balls connect. If my stroke was made off the putting green, I'm not penalized. So inherently, there's no penalty there. So that's why it's saying in this case, unless there's an agreement made, there's no penalty, because as we saw in Rule 11, if both balls were on the putting green, then Rule 11.1 would take place, which is the exception to say, if a player's ball in motion, again, in stroke play, again, this is all stroke play. If a player's ball in motion hits another ball at rest on the putting green and both balls were on the putting green before the stroke, the player gets the general penalty. So the rules already kind of guard against this automatically. So, I don't say backstopping doesn't exist on the putting green, but if I putt and there's another ball on the putting green and I hit that, I only penalized 2 strokes in stroke play. So the rules already kind of guard against that. But in the case that we see here in backstopping, the rules don't guard against that. If I just chip and hit a ball anywhere, as long as there was an agreement, I'm not penalized. So here, on its natural state, there's no penalty. Again, the agreement is what really kicks in this rule. You have to agree somewhere to backstop. Again, and when both balls in the putting green, you could backstop, you get asked to backstop, I guess, and you'd still be penalized if you asked to do it like we saw. But in any case, if I putt, hit a bad putt, another ball at rest, I'm going to be penalized 2 strokes for hitting that ball at rest on the putting green when I made a stroke from the putting green. So here, just a delineation there of why it's saying off the putting green, on the putting green. All right, following up on that interpretation or that clarification, it says, consequently, the RNA and USGA offer players the following guidance and explanation of best practice. In stroke play, stroke play only, the competition involves all players, and because each player in the competition cannot be present to protect his or her own interests, protecting the field is an important responsibility that all players in the competition share. Therefore, in stroke play, if there is a reasonable possibility that a player's ball, and again, reasonable possibility, if we're both on a par 3 and someone hits it close to the tee, it would be unreasonable for them to say, hey, I'm going to go mark my ball because I don't want you to backstop. That's pretty unreasonable. If there is a reasonable possibility, again, chip shot on around the green, right, that a player's ball close to the hole could help another player who is about to play from off the green. Again, if it's on the green, the rules already kind of take care of that. If I putt and I hit that other ball already, I'm going to penalize 2 strokes. Both players should ensure that the player whose ball is close to the hole marks and lifts that ball before the other player plays. If all players follow this best practice, it ensures the protection of the interests of everyone in the competition. And this was added well after these rules were written. These were written in January, or introduced January of 2019. They were in play January 2019, and this was added a full year after that once there were some issues with it. Again, it says should, it doesn't say must. It says here's the best practice to avoid that. So in any case, if we look at this situation here, this is the backstopping situation. If there's a ball here and this is someone else's ball, and I'm chipping from off the putting green, this ball could serve as a backstop to me in stroke play. And if me and other players say, hey, player, can you agree to, let's leave that ball there so I can use it to maybe slow my ball, that ball down. Player says, yeah, go ahead. And I make a stroke. As soon as I make a stroke, that agreement, we've made is going to be, we're both going to be penalized in that case. We both made an agreement. It doesn't matter where my ball ends up at because we made an agreement to backstop. We're going to be penalized there. So again, in this case, if I'm the other player and that's my ball, and the other player, let's say they're about to quick play, and we'll get to this, but I can say, hey, I don't want you to play. I want to go mark my ball so you can't backstop. That's totally fine. That player is then required to wait till I get up there and mark my ball. If he jumps that right that I've set down to say, I want to mark my ball to protect the field, and the player makes a stroke, I'm jumping ahead a little here, but we'll see the player is going to be penalized for not letting me protect the field. We'll see that. But again, we see it on tour, but it really comes down to, was an agreement made to backstop. If another player just quick plays in this situation right quick and no agreement was made, that other player, I don't call it an advantage, but they didn't agree and it's not backstopping. It doesn't look good. It's not backstopping. So they're not penalized for that. So that's why that clarification was added to say, to avoid the appearance of evil, if there's ever a situation like this, again, off the putting green, and they're chipping, then one of them may say, hey, can you please mark that? That's the proper thing to do. All right, and let's look at an interpretation here right quick. It says breach for leaving helping ball in place does not require knowledge. So it says in stroke play, rule 15.3a, If two or more players agree to leave a ball in place on the putting green to help any player, and the stroke is made with the helping ball left in place, each player who made the agreement gets 2 penalty strokes, general penalty. A breach of Rule 15.3 does not depend on whether the players know that an agreement is not allowed. So if this happens, and I say, well, yeah, let's agree to backstop, and then someone's a rules official says, hey, you're not allowed to do that. I don't get off the hook by saying, oh, I didn't know that wasn't the rule. In the same way, if I hit it into a penalty area and a rules official says, hey, it's a 1-stroke penalty for hitting it and taking relief out of a penalty area, I'm not absolved of the rule because, oh, I didn't know it was a 1-stroke penalty to hit the penalty area for some reason. It's still a rule. So it doesn't matter if you require knowledge or not. We're going to take it a step further. And what if you did know? We'll see that. For example, though, leading off of this rule, in stroke play before playing from just off the putting green, again, it's very specific. It's creating a situation where off the putting green, a ball on the putting green. If they're both on, then Rule 11.1a takes place that we just saw. A player asks another player to leave his or her ball that is near the hole in order to use it as a backstop. Without knowing this is not allowed, the other player says, sure, agrees to leave his or her ball by the hole to help the other player. Once the stroke is made, that's the trigger point. Both players are in the general penalty under 15.3a, 2 strokes. The same outcome would apply if the player whose ball was near the hole offered to leave the ball in play, helping the other player, and the other player accepted the offer and then played. It's mighty nice of them. They're both going to get penalized 2 strokes. And taking it a step further, so in the first 3 paragraphs here, the rules are assuming that me or the other player doesn't know this isn't allowed. I'm just being nice. Hey, we're playing stroke play, but I'll leave my ball there. Totally fine. I'll let you backstop off it. Player says, thanks. In that case, player should have said, no, you need to mark it. We can't make the agreement. That's proper. But in any case, the player goes on to play the stroke. We're both penalized. Even if we didn't know it, doesn't matter. We're still penalized for breaching this rule here. Conversely, if the players know that they're not allowed to make such an agreement, but still do it, they are both disqualified under 1.3b1 for deliberately ignoring the rules, in this case, ignoring 15.3a. So if we're playing and I'm playing and I say, well, I know it's not okay to backstop, but that's the dumb rule. We're going to do it anyways. Go ahead and play. And he says, yeah, it's stupid. Let's just go ahead and do it. As soon as that stroke's made, again, we're both disqualified because we knew a rule and deliberately agreed, again, there's verbal communication there, to not adhere to it. So this rule could escalate. And if we didn't know, okay, we didn't know it's 2 strokes. But if you did know, okay, you just deliberately agreed to breach the rule of golf. And now you're going to be disqualified under Rule 1.3b. Looking at that, 1.3b, let's go and break it down a little further. In 1.3b1, if 2 or more players, again, with this situation in mind, deliberately agree to ignore any rule or penalty, then it applies. So agree to ignore any rule, 15.3, they will be disqualified unless the agreement is made before the round and is canceled before any player involved in the agreement begins his or her round. We don't get to it, but the example I believe they use is, hey, let's concede all putts within 2 feet. Okay, that's fine. One of us tees off, we're both disqualified because we knew that wasn't okay, let's say. Because we deliberately agreed to say, even though it's not allowed, we're going to do it because let's just expedite the process, right? Can't do that. If we know it, we're disqualified. And then following right after that, kind of hinging on it, Rule 1.3b1, I'm sorry, 2, Rule 1.3b1/2. In order to agree to ignore a rule or penalty, players must be aware the rule exists. So there's deliberate knowledge to circumvent the rules of golf here. It says 1.3b1 does not apply, and there is no penalty if players agree to waive a rule that they are not aware of or fail to apply a penalty that they do not know exists. So these are very different. So in the first example, if we know it's not okay, like we saw in that interpretation, this is just adding more clarity to it. If we know that that's not okay and we still do it, say, oh, it's a dumb rule, let's just ignore it, we're disqualified. But if we didn't know and say, oh, I'll be nice, I'll let you backstop, but I'm sure the rules allow it, we didn't deliberately agree to ignore that rule, we're not disqualified, we're still penalized. So again, this is just kind of giving more clearance to the clarification to that interpretation that we saw just then about deliberately agreeing and knowing that it's breaching the rule versus, well, we didn't really know, you still did it, so you're going to get penalized. It's just, well, did you know that it wasn't allowed? That's the key here. Again, going back to 15.3, we see, again, this is, we kind of chop it up. We look at the ball as helping play, and then 15.3b, we have interfering, and then C is helping and interfering. And C kind of ropes in the ball marker. In A and B, it's ball, and then in C, it's ball marker. So clarification there. But again, we had helping, and now we're looking at interfering and interfering in the second ones. So a ball on anywhere on course interfering with play. So this is anywhere on the golf course. And then we're going to look at is what does it mean to interfere? Okay, well, there's interference. What do the rules say interference is? Interference under this rule exists when another player's ball at rest might interfere with player's area of intended stance or intended swing. So obviously, if I'm going to be stepping on another player's ball, that's interference when I'm taking my stance to play my ball. And is or on or close to the player's line of play, such that given the intended stroke, there is a reasonable chance that the player's ball in motion could hit that ball. So we're both just off the putting green, and I've got a low running chip, or I'm even putting the ball, and their ball is not on the putting green. That would be interference because I'm going to putt through it. It could be the same if their ball was on the putting green, it would mark it, and if it's still interfered, we'll get to the ball marker in 15.3 C, and is close enough to distract the player in making the stroke. So this is the opposite of Rule 16. So in this case, if there's a golf ball here and a golf ball here, and I'm playing this way, it doesn't physically interfere, but it's very distracting, which doesn't happen a lot. Typically, if it's close enough to distract, it's probably going to be close enough where you're actually interfering with it. That is also deemed interference or treated as interference here. And this is in Rule 16, which is next week. If you're close enough to the cart path or sprinkler head, but it doesn't interfere, but it distracts you, that doesn't matter. You don't get relief from that. The ball, though, so it's the opposite of what we see in Rule 16. So if there's mental interference, as we'll call it, you can get relief, or not relief, to have them move their ball. So this is when relief is allowed from an interfering ball. So we just saw what does interference mean? Okay, now we have interference when we get relief allowed. If a player reasonably believes that another player's ball anywhere on the course might interfere with the player's own play, the player may require the other player to mark the spot and lift the ball, and the ball must not be clean. This is one of those 4 exceptions you saw in Rule 14, where, and you see it again when you watch on TV, the player will mark the ball if they've been asked to lift and move the ball, kind of pinch it and either hold it like this or they'll put it off to the side to show that there's no cleaning going on. So in this case, if I say, hey, your ball it's right where my foot's going to stand, can you move it? The player say, yeah, they'll mark it, move it. They can move the mark out of the way. We'll see that. But they're not allowed to clean it when they lift the ball under 3B2. If the other player does not mark the spot of the ball before lifting or cleans the lifted ball when not allowed, he or she gets 1 penalty stroke. So if they mark it and say, yeah, I'll move it out of the way, and there's some mud on it, they're going to get penalized 1 stroke for cleaning a ball when not allowed when lifted under the rule. So the rule allows it to be lifted, but does not allow it to be clean. Again, that's one of those 4 exceptions we see in Rule 14. In stroke play only, so, match play, it's very important, the order of play. You could, supersede that and say, oh, we're going to match play, just go ahead, I don't care, that's fine. But typically, whoever's furthest away, the rules are going to say you play first. In stroke play only, a player required to lift his or her ball under this rule may play first instead. So if I'm technically away, but my ball, as a right-hander, I'm going to be stepping on someone else's golf ball. The easiest thing to do might say, do you want to go first just so you don't have to do all this? Yeah, we're both right-handed. They play first, then I step in and play. In match play, it's a little more important. That's ready golf right there. That's really recommended, I would say, to go ahead and let that person just go ahead and play first. If they're not going to have interference from your ball, if you're the only one with interference, you go ahead, or they go ahead, rather, let them play. A player is not allowed to lift his or her ball under this rule based only on the player's own belief that the ball might interfere with another player's play. So in this case, you have to be invited, or that player who picks the ball up has to be invited to do that when the ball's not on the putting green. So on the putting green, we know you can mark it, lift it, clean it, do whatever you want, doesn't matter. But I can't say, oh, well, you're going to be standing on the ball, let me go ahead and get it out of the way for you. You weren't invited to do that. You can't do that until someone's asked you to come into play. You can't assume, because you're getting your hands on the ball, and you're not cleaning it, but you're disturbing your true lie that you actually had. And while you're doing your best to create it, you never really get back to where it was supposed to be, where it was the first time. So you have to be invited. The other player says, hey, I need you to mark and move your ball, or go ahead and play. So if you pick your ball without being asked, in this case, off the putting green, you're going to be penalized. You have to be invited here. Again, it might interfere. You have to know, hey, please pick the ball up, move your ball, mark it, lift it. Okay, yeah. If the player lifts his or her ball when not required to do so by the other player, except in lifting the ball on the putting green, the player gets 1 penalty stroke. So again, I need to be invited here. So if I just do it and it's off the putting green and nobody said anything, that's not okay. Again, so cutting this up a little further, we look at the ball on the putting green helping interfere with play, the ball anywhere on the course interfere with play. Now we look at the ball marker. So we've shifted from the golf ball itself to the ball marker. This is heavily inferring it's on the putting green. We'll talk about when it's off, kind of like we just said here a minute ago. But this is typically going to be what you see on the putting green. You see a lot on TV when it's right in the line. Ball marker helping interfering with play. And 95% of this is going to be on the putting green, but there is that 5%, like we kind of just talked about, where it's off the putting green. So in 15.3c, it's helping and interfering. It's not just interfering, it's not just helping, it's both kind of wrapped into one here. So as opposed to what we saw in 15.3a and b, it's helping and interfering in the same rule for a ball marker, not the ball, for a ball marker. So if a ball marker might help or interfere with play, a player may move the ball, or move the ball marker rather, out of the way if it is his or her own. And just as a note here, this is kind of contrast to what we just saw. If the ball or marker might help or interfere play, again, using the putting, I don't have to be invited to go do that. I can just do it. So what we saw here in 15.3b, again, just look at the difference here. The ball marker, if it might help or interfere with play, I can just move it. I don't have to be asked. I can just take my putter head length and move it over. Obviously, you're still showing your work and marking it along as you go, versus what we just saw, a player is not allowed to lift his or her ball based solely on the belief that it might interfere. So big difference there. In Rule 15.3c, if you have a ball marker, it's on the putting green, if it helps or interferes and you think there's no invitation necessary, you can just do it. It doesn't require invitation, but in the other ones it does. So it's just an interesting, contrast there. And really the reason I think it is because when you have your ball marked, again, you're estimating the spot where you put it back. If usually it's on the putting green, all lies are created equal essentially on the putting green. So it's not a big deal. And the rules allow you to mark and lift your ball. You're kind of expected to do that. Most people don't just play their ball on the putting green. They mark it, lift it, clean it, whatever. So you're expected to do that. Whereas if you're having to be invited when your ball's interfering with play off the putting green, you're getting the ball in your hand and you're not cleaning it, but you're really disturbing your true lie. You're picking the ball up, and when you put it back, although you're recreating it, you really can't recreate the essence of what your lie truly was, especially if there's a lot going on around it. Again, you get it to the best it was. So I think the difference there is when it's talking about 15.3c, it's again inferring putting green, which, yeah, you're marking it and lifting it anyway, so you don't have to be invited. But when you get your hands on your ball in play to move it, you need to be invited because it's a big deal. You're destroying essentially the lie that you had. Again, you're recreating it as best you can, but you never truly really recreate it, in my opinion. So that's why I think the difference is there. Again, very small thing, but something to note. Moving on, if the ball marker belongs to another player, you can require that player to move the ball marker out of the way for the same reasons you may require a ball to be lifted under Rule 15.3a and 15.3b. And we see this all the time. I've got a 10-foot putt. There's a ball marker at 5 feet. It's right in my line. I say, hey, Kate, can you move that one to the left or right? Kate says, sure, that's fine. Again, prior to that, she could move it on her own, but typically she wouldn't do that. But here I can ask and say, hey, that's in my way. We see that a lot, especially with ball markers becoming more creative and bigger. And you see poker chips and big ones and custom ones, and they're not just dimes and pennies anymore. They're a lot bigger out there now. So, or there's a T or something. So anyway, the ball marker must be moved out of the way to a new spot, measured from its original spot, such as by using one or more club head lengths. We see this a lot. Ball marker's there, put my putter head down and line it up with a tree or something in the distance, an identifying mark, move it that way. Player plays through. I got to move it back, as we see. But it says it's giving you guidance here to move it one or more club head lengths out of the way. And it says either the lifted ball must be replaced on that original spot, or the ball marker. Typically, we go ball marker, we move it, we move the ball marker back. But if when I moved it back, I wanted to just simply place the ball on that spot, that's fine too. the ball and or ball marker has to be returned back to the original spot where the ball was first lifted from. All right, and then the penalty for breach of Rule 15.3 is the general penalty, and that's for the entirety of 15.3. That's not just for what we just saw. So 15.3 A, B, and C, the general penalty like we saw for backstopping, which infers two strokes in stroke play. So the general penalty is for everything there, and not just A, B, or C, but for all of it, or not just C. It kind of falls under C, but it goes back to A, B, and C. It doesn't just say 15.3C. Says this penalty, and by this penalty, we mean 15.3, general penalty. So the general penalty also applies if the player makes a stroke without waiting for a helping ball or ball marker to be lifted after becoming aware that another player, one, intended to lift it or move it, and how you gauge intention is subjective, I guess, and or had required someone else to do so. Again, kind of like I said earlier, that could be, hey, my ball's really close. I'd like to go mark it before you play in stroke play or match play, actually, because I don't want it to serve as a backstop for you. That player has to wait. If they make a stroke here without waiting for that helping ball or ball marker to be lifted or moved after becoming aware that another player, me, intended to lift it or move it. Again, I intended to lift that ball, mark it, lift it, and move it. Or I required someone else to. I could say, hey, player C, wait, player B, can you mark your ball on the putting green? Because I think that's going to be in a position to serve as a backstop for player C, and I'd like to protect the field. This rule says that player C, has to wait till that ball is marked before they can play. If they jump that right here, we're going to see this penalty also applies. The general penalty also applies. And again, if it's match play, it's simply a loss of hole. Because again, going back, in match play, if someone jumps that right, they're still going to be penalized. The agreement is just there. If I want to say, yeah, go ahead, in match play, I'll let you backstop and say, hey, thanks, that's not a penalty. But if the player's now known, I want to protect myself in match play and say, hey, I don't want you to backstop, and the player makes a swing at it, great, I just won the hole, thank you, let's move on. So there are restrictions there, and there's guidance there to help out. Or the penalty also applies if the player refuses to lift his or her ball marker or move his or her ball or ball marker. Refuses to lift his or her ball or ball marker when required to do so, and a stroke is then made. Again, doesn't matter about contact. Stroke's made by the other player whose play might have been helped or interfered with. Again, if you've required somebody to do that and they refuse to do it and say, no, I'm not going to do that, the other player goes on and plays, there's penalty there, right? So again, you can always protect the field. Anytime you want to do this, you say, hey, I'm going to protect the field. I'm going to ask you to mark it. I'm going to mark my ball. You're always entitled to do that under the rules here. And then it says the penalty for playing incorrectly, substitute ball, or playing a ball from the wrong place in breach of Rule 13.3, the general penalty. And then if multiple rule breaches from a single act or related act occur, see Rule 1.3C4. The only thing that I didn't cover that I wanted to cover, and I meant to add this in, I thought I did, was if there's two balls interfering in the general area, or let's say it's in the bunker. And we talked about this a little bit in 8.1D in recreating a condition affecting the stroke that was worse than another player. Here, this is when it really applies, I think, too, is if there's two golf balls in a bunker next to each other, and whoever's away is going to play first, and I say, hey, can you mark, lift, and move your ball? The player would mark where their ball was in the sand, measure, let's say a club length, 7-iron driver, doesn't matter, away, marks it there. So in a bigger sense, when you do the club head thing on the putting green where you're going, your ball marker, one club head length, obviously when you're in the general area, this is not going to do. So that same concept, let's use a full club to get it out of the way, same procedure, mark it there. I would play, I just destroy the lie that our ball had been in. When you move it back, you recreate the lie best you can, or I could recreate the lie best you can, and place that ball without cleaning it back on that spot. And if the lie was altered, again, you're recreating it in the sand. If it wasn't altered, then you're just replacing it. But again, in a broader scale, when you go on the putting green, you go putter head length over and back. And if it's in the general area bunker penalty area, you can go club length. That's the recommended procedure. Mark it, lift it, move it, and do the whole thing backwards. Put your ball back on the spot. If the lie or a condition affecting the stroke is altered, that's when Rule 8.1D is going to come in to help. So again, I meant to say that earlier. We talked about it. So just to clarify, that's all for this rule in 15.3, and also all for Rule 15 in general. Are there any questions that we want to talk about? Again, it could be with this, it could be, let's do 15 first, but if there's anything you saw over the weekend at match play that doesn't apply to this, we can talk about that too. But Kate, anything in the chat immediately that I didn't cover?
Yep. There's one in here from Wendy about
Okay.
15.1. The ball at rest on a big leaf on the putting green. Are they allowed to remove that leaf? If it's allowed, where to replace the ball? If it's not allowed, which rule prohibits it?
Okay, so ball came to rest on a big leaf on the putting green. So the ball's not touching the putting green in that case. So the answer is yes, you can move a loose impediment because again, and I don't know where the slide is. I don't know if I can cycle back to it, but if you moved a loose impediment that caused your ball to move on the putting green, there's no penalty. And you put the ball back. I guess the rules don't necessarily cover that because it covers if the ball's not in or on a movable obstruction. It doesn't say if the ball's in or on a loose impediment. Using equity, I would say in the same way, you could mark your ball, lift or move the loose impediment, put the ball back on the spot, operating under the same procedures of a movable obstruction. I don't think, it's a good question. I don't think it says that anywhere, but cobbling a lot of things together with that procedure, if it's a towel, that's what you would do, right? And there's no penalty. So in the same way, the loose impediment, I'd mark, if you could mark it or move it, put it back on the spot, and kind of like we saw earlier, if you move a loose impediment and cause your ball to move, you put it back on the spot. So in this way, you move the loose impediment, you pull the leaf out and it causes your ball to move and put it back on the spot. I don't know if there's any other than that, which is at the beginning of 15.1. I don't think there's any other specific instances that translate a ball in or on a movable obstruction, which is the closest related situation, I think, to this, to loose impediment. I think we can mesh those together. It's a good question. I just don't think it covers that necessarily, but we can cobble together some stuff. And good question, Wendy. You always have good questions. So I think that's what I would say. Again, just not having thought about it terribly much. So Wendy, does that sound good? Does that make sense? Okay. Any other questions?
Okay, there's one more. Yep. Clarification on a ball marker just off line of that may help deflect a ball towards the hole. Must it be moved? What if it is moved and the putt hits the marker? Yeah, so there's no,
I guess you could say that it's more of a player etiquette thing. If I asked the ball marker to be moved in the position and I hit it, I don't think the rules cover that necessarily here where, if and I guess maybe the question is if I have a 10-footer, just to put it into concrete terms, and there's a 5-footer that's the ball's been marked and I just leave it there and sometimes people use it as a guide to say, oh great, I'm going to roll right over the right edge of that ball marker. In that case, I'd say, yeah, if the ball marker's there and it serves as a possible aim point, that's fine. And if the other player says, well, I'm going to move it so you can't do that, like we just saw, that's the other player's right, because the player could say, I want to move my helping ball marker out of the way, and they can do that. And if you putt before that, we've just seen you kind of jumped that right, and you're going to be penalized, the general penalty there, stroke play or match play. So hopefully, I don't know if that answers the question or not, but yeah, if the ball marker's there and you putt over it and it deflects the ball, we saw in Rule 11, if a ball in the first or second exception to 11.1b exception 2, if a ball played from the putting green hits a ball or a ball marker that is also at rest on the putting green, the ball is played as it lies and there's no penalty. So there, very specifically in 11.1b exception 2, it says that. Again, if it's a deliberate thing where, hey, move it over to the left so I can actually deflect off of it into the hole, that might be more of, again, like a Rule 1 thing where you're going to be disqualified for serious breach of conduct, maybe. But we see in Rule 11, yeah, if you hit a ball marker, you don't get to replay that stroke or cancel and replay, and you're not penalized for it. So sometimes that works out. If the ball marker's there, it's like, great, that's a good line for me. And that's fine too. And you're going to hit it probably. And that's, that intentionalness of using it as an aim point is not covered in the fact that it's not covered. So therefore, it kind of is covered because it says, yeah, in 11.1b exception 2, you're not penalized for that. Hopefully that answered it. I know that was a long answer, but I'm not quite sure that answered it.
Nothing else in the chat for now.
Anybody have any questions? Just want to unmute and ask away or anything, or? Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining in. Again, we'll post these on our Rules of Golf page. And then next week on Monday, we'll cover Rule 16, which is another very applicable, and that's abnormal course conditions. What do you do when your ball's in ground under repair? Cart path relief. We're going to cover embedded ball. So that one's going to be really applicable. So next week, join in for that. We'll be at 9 o'clock on Monday. If you have any questions, always feel free to email or give me a call, and I'll be happy to answer those. But again, thanks everyone for coming out, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.